Hey guys, in today's video we're going to be talking about how to build a gable end on the ground. So this is the gable truss, the second truss in, all of the outlookers, your sheeting, Tyvek, and Subfascia, as well as the H1 clips that go on the outlookers for wind uplift. So let's get to it. So we got our two gable trusses here. You can tell because of the uprights for our sheeting and siding. Now this first part, when we're sheeting the gable, it's important to pay attention to which side you're sheeting, because a lot of gables only go on one way because of the slope or the tails. So you got to make sure that you're sheeting the right side of the gable. Now take your time and think through this. On these two behind me, we have a mono pitch running the length of this end of the house. So as long as we're sheeting them opposite, so that they're a mirror image of each other, we know we're sheeting the right side. So the way we ran our sheeting on the walls already is that it's sticking up past the gable end 1 3/4 of an inch. And that's so that it ties this truss in. It will come up and split this halfway. So we're gonna pull up 2 inches and we're gonna chalk a line here. That gives us a 1/4 inch gap so we don't ever have to fight it when we're setting this gable unit. Now when you're sheeting these, you want to make sure that the ground's somewhat flat. It doesn't have to be perfectly flat because this sheeting won't hold the shape if you sheet it with a little curve, but you definitely want it to be flat. Makes this easier. Now we're using a staple gun for this. Gables don't need any shear strength because they already form a triangle, so they hold themselves in shape. But we use an 1.5 inch staple when we're sheeting our gables. That way it doesn't come through the back side of the truss, and it makes everything easier. Like if you're sheeting the gable right on the stack of trusses, you can sheet it and not have to worry about it sticking to the truss underneath. So we're going to go ahead and line it up on our line here, on our chalk line that we made. So we're going to chalk a line down the top here, and when we cut this sheeting, we do not want it to stick out past it all. It's okay if it's even 1 inch in, it all gets covered up, but we want it at least below the top of the truss. Make sure to set your saw depth on this one. We like to use a crappier blade, just because you might hit some metal plates if they put their plates too high. So set it to just over 1/2 inch and run it across the top. Okay, we'll go ahead and sheet our other one here, and we can use our scrap, our cutoff, for this other piece here. It's big enough, and it's fine to put these upside down. They're the same strength, it doesn't mess with anything. You just don't have lines to see where studs are. This is one of the few cuts that I'll use this part on the saw to sight in my chalk line. On everything else it needs to be accurate, so I look at the blade to make sure I'm splitting the line. But this is just quick and dirty. Okay, so the next step is to Tyvek these gables. Now, you want to think about how you're Tyvecking below the gable, because for example, on this one, we have 11-foot wall right here. So we'll have a 9-foot row of Tyvek down below it, and then we'll have a 2-foot gap. So we're gonna try and leave 2.5 foot of flap, and then we'll just fold it up and staple it to this, so that when we get it up there, we can just rip off that flap a little bit, fold it down, and it will give us our 6-inch overlap. So here we are. We're gonna get our 2.5, 3-foot overlap down below. We'll line it up on the end here. Now we'll pull it tight. make sure to staple this top edge really well, because when the siders come in and put in their soffit, they're gonna chalk a line right here. So we don't want this flapping around because it makes it very difficult to chalk that line. Now we'll fold up our overlap here and staple it on. When you're doing this, you don't want to bunch it up and then put a staple through that. Because when you rip this off, it's going to tear holes everywhere that staple goes through. So you mainly want to staple where the overlap is, so that when it tears holes in it, it's over top of another piece of Tyvek. On this cable, since it's so short and we have so much overlap, and it's super high wind up here, I'm just gonna screw a board right on top of this bundle. Since it's just a tiny screw hole, I'm not worried about going through the Tyvek. Now we're gonna pick this gable up and we're gonna flip it over on these sawhorses with the sheeting and Tyvek down. On bigger trusses, you'll have to use a telehandler to do this. The biggest one we've done was a 35-foot wide, or maybe it was 40-foot wide gable with an 8/12 pitch. So it was very large. Okay, so we got our gable truss up here with our sheeting down, and we want to have this section hanging off the sawhorses because we're going to put our outlookers along here and they're going to dip down off the roof. We'll go ahead and lay our outlookers up here with the painted end in. Check out our outlooker video to see how we do those. And we'll, as well as our 22.5-inch blocks, we're going to lay them here. So the hardest part of putting outlookers on here is figuring out where the first one goes. Now, the way we space our outlookers is every 2 feet in order so that it lands on a sheeting seam. So we have to know where our first piece of sheeting is going to go on the roof in order to put this first outlooker down. But to know where our first piece of sheeting goes, we have to know where our subfascia goes. So we already got this second truss here laying down. This truss is what goes on the roof right after this truss. So we're going to use this truss to figure out where the first outlooker goes. So we're here down at the tail end of this truss. Now we have a 16-inch overhang, which is off of the framing, and we have an 1.5-inch fascia board or subfascia board. So we're going to go 14.5. That allows us, that's where we're going to cut our tail. So when we put our 1.5-inch fascia board, it will be a 16-inch overhang. Here's where we cut our tail. We have a 3/12 pitch on this roof. And then we're going to draw in our subfascia. So right here is an 1.5 inch for our subfascia. So our sheeting is going to slide down here and nail on. We don't want it to stick out past this point. So I'm going to line up my tape right on this line here. So it's like I'm coming off of the subfascia. Now I'm going to go up 48.25. I'm going to make a mark. That is going to be the center of our first outlooker because our sheeting splits right there. So to transfer this mark to our other truss is the trickiest part because our gable here is a drop truss, which means it's 3.5 inches lower than this truss. That's because our outlookers are going to tie in like this, and then they're going to sit on the gable truss. So to transfer it over there, we're going to square our line down from the top here. Now, the underside of this 2x4 is actually the top of the gable truss. So we're going to hook our tape right in line with this heel. And then we have our measurement of 32 and just over 5/8 to the center of our first outlooker. Now we come over to our gable, line up our tape right on this heel. We go 32, just past 5/8. And that is the center of our first outlooker. So we're going to go 3/4 down the truss to get the start of our first outlooker. So the first board we put on is a 2x6 right here. We want it right at the edge of where our outlooker starts. So we're kind of splitting this in half, the 2x6, so it overlaps. We're gonna nail it on with some 3-inch nails. Now we're gonna add our 2x4 tail to this truss, flush with the edge of the 2x6. You wanna make sure it's sitting tight to the truss here, because this is the actual roof plane where the sheeting gets nailed. You can put some toenails down through these, as long as you angle it steep. There's our tail. Now, we're good to go ahead and start adding our outlookers on top of it. So we're putting the painted end in the house. It has the proper measurements for the right spacing. Here's our lines for where the gable truss goes. So we're gonna hold it down here. We wanna make sure those lines are exactly on each side of the truss. That's very important. We'll put a toenail down into the gable, and then we'll nail into our block here. Then we're gonna go down the line. The next step is to put in the 22.5-inch spacer. So we'll put it in tight here. We're gonna toenail through the end of it. And this one we can't really toenail from this side, or whatever, nail from this side. So we can put a few toenails into the outlooker. And then 2 very steep angled toenails. That holds it on. We're gonna come back and put H1 clips on these so that it's actually really strong when the wind is pushing up on this overhang. So then we just keep going down the line here, making sure that each board is tight to itself so that we keep our spacing proper. So here we are at the top of our gable, and since this is a mono pitch gable, not just a normal triangle, we're gonna run our tail long here so that we can have a nailer for our subfascia up here. So we're gonna do the same thing that we did down below. We'll just throw a 2x6 on so that it holds this, holds the lever. And then we'll throw our tail on underneath it, making sure it's tight to that truss. We'll nail it through the outlooker as well. After we fly this truss up, we'll chalk this with the rest of the tails on the other trusses. So we'll just leave it long for now. Now the next thing we do is we're gonna lift that next truss up and over and on top of these. But before we do that, we gotta put in some spacers. So these will support the bottom of the truss as we set it on. Now these are the same measurement as right here on these outlookers. This is the proper spacing. It's 21 3/4. That's pretty standard for your truss layout, but always check your truss layout before you cut your outlookers and these. I like to cut these after I get that part done, just because sometimes they'll get mixed up with these 22.5s because they're so close. And then that absolutely screws up your spacing. So don't get these mixed up with your 22.5s. Now for this one, we're just gonna put it up here, flush to the top of this bottom cord. And that allows us to not interfere with our sheetrock backer that goes down here. There's gonna be a 2x6 that runs down here. So flush with the top. I'm gonna kind of get it spaced out so that it holds the truss. And then these just get some good toenails so that they hold. Next, we'll lift the truss up on top. So we got our truss up here, and we already marked out center of our first outlooker when we were finding our outlooker spacing. So we're good to pull 3/4 on this, 3/4 over, so we get our edge, and then we just flush this up and nail it off. You can put some toenails through your outlooker if you're worried about it spreading, but this is such a small gable, I'm not gonna do that. So now we can pull layout off of right here and mark out our outlookers where they get nailed. It's just 2 foot. When I was learning how to do this, I was always worried about the trusses not being square with each other. But if you get your outlookers nailed in the right spot, you can just nail these blocks in where they sit. And then when you set it on the wall and flush up your heels, it does all the squaring you need. So it's great. If you guys are getting any value out of this video, please subscribe to our channel, because we're doing a video for every skill it takes to frame a quality house. Okay, the next step we're doing, we don't do this on every gable we build on the ground, but because we ran our sheeting up already, we don't want to have this board up on the wall. It doubles as our sheetrock backer, and it ties in the gable here so that it doesn't lift off the wall. But since we ran our sheeting up already, we don't want to have to fit the truss down in between. So we're just going to screw it on now, and that will help straighten our truss. So when we're screwing these off, we don't want it to be down below the truss at all. If anything, we want it to be up, inset above this. I'm only using screws so that this truss pulls tight to this 2x6. Like down on the end there, you can see the truss is sagging off a little bit. So we're gonna use screws to get it tight, but nails are what we use to nail this board on most of the time. So the last thing we do before we flip it up and put our subfascia on is to put a pick point so that when we pick it up with the telly, we have a firm place to fasten it to. So we usually use like a 2x8 or 2x10. That's strong enough to lift most of the gables we do. This is a very small gable, so a 2x6 would be fine for it. But normally we have a gable truss that's a triangle, it has a peak. So you just put it right in at the peak, and you know that's your center of mass. But on this one, we're just gonna put it right in here. We're gonna nail this off to a board, and then we'll probably tie another pick point to one of these outlookers just to help balance it out. The outlooker won't take most of the weight. This will take most of the weight of the gable. So when I'm nailing this board in for our pick point, I'm making sure that it's tight to something on the top, because we don't want the weight to be carried by the fasteners. We want it to be carried by the wood to wood connection, because these gables get very heavy when they're all sheeted with all this wood in it. Now we're going to stand this unit up and put our subfascia on the front here. We'll try it. Oh yeah, nice. We're going to nail our subfascia right on here. We already pre-cut all these outlookers. We used to run them long and chalk them, but when we build them on the ground, it's just way too hard to straighten your gable truss so that you can chalk a line. You gotta level it, you gotta plumb it, you gotta string it, it's just a lot. So we started cutting these to length. We have about a 1/16 of variance on these, and we'll show you guys how to straighten your trusses after they're set, so you get perfectly straight subfascia. So right here, I'm flushing this up before I nail, and I want to end the board in the middle of an outlooker cavity. That's very important for keeping it straight. So we're flush on top. We're gonna put 2 solid nails into the outlooker. Then I'm just gonna flush the tops as I go down. The reason we break our subfascia between the outlookers is because we can put a block in here. We'll flush it up with the top. It can be a 2x6 or a 2x4, it doesn't matter. Oh, baby. Baby, don't do it to me. With this block here, if these outlookers are at different heights, we can flush up this piece and then come back and flush up the seam so it balances it out and does a real good job at straightening this run out. Because then we can tweak this up to match the height. So we'll nail this board on to the outlookers first, and then we'll come back and nail this seam last. So for this next part here, I realized I messed up, and I've never made a mistake in my life, so this is actually really embarrassing. First time ever messing anything up. But these lines are actually supposed to be on the bottom. We chalked all these lines at once when we made our outlookers. They're 1.5 inches out. And the reason for that is so that we can run a string line up the bottom of our outlookers. We'll show you how we do that now. And we're just gonna go ahead and make a mark on a few of them at 1.5 inches. Doesn't take that long, but for future reference, when you're placing your outlookers, if you do straighten your gables this way, put that line down. So to put our string on, we're gonna put a block at each end of the truss. When we run the string up the bottom of these outlookers, we're gonna be able to look up from inside the house and see if the string is off of the line that we have. That way we'll know if we need to lean the truss in or out. Normally on a gable truss, you plumb the center, and after you have the center plumb, you can look up and see that line, this string line, isn't in line with these. So we'll be able to plumb in between the top and the sides to make sure that these trusses are perfectly straight. When we do that and we straighten these trusses, it straightens our subfascia because all of our outlookers are cut to the exact length. So you can see the string line is right by that pencil mark there. As we straighten out the truss, we get it right over the pencil mark. So that will help us when we're string lining this truss. So there we have it. We got all our pieces assembled here. Now we're ready to fly it and set it up on the roof. We'll show you that next. We're getting ready to fly this thing, set it up on the house, but I realized I forgot to put these H1s on. This is something I like to put on right after the outlookers. So they just tuck under here. They're for wind uplift on this gable overhang. We're using a positive placement gun with 1.5 inch nails. And it's a lot easier to put them on now than in the attic after the truss is set or the roof is sheeted. Now in our area, they call for these H1s every other outlooker, and that meets the uplift code where we are. Now we're gonna pick it up and fly it off of our anchor point here. We'll probably have another rope to balance it out. So when we're hooking up these gables to fly them, since this truss is sheeted, our center of mass is right about here. So I like to put a little stopper block on this pick point so that the strap doesn't slide. That keeps us somewhat balanced in the air. So we got our truss up here. We're butted tight to our sheet on the outside. The way we can tell that is we want this inside to be 1.5 inches here, because this pushes our 2x6 1.5 inches over the wall. So it's our sheetrock backer here. And when we're at about 1.5 inches, we can nail down on top of the studs. And we can pull this over to our mark here and nail that as well. Also, you want to make sure that this is sitting down here. Sometimes this is rolled and you can put a lag screw with a washer through this to pull it down. But this cable went real smooth. It flushed up between our sheeting on each end. And now we're ready to set all our trusses off of it. Pretty cool. Right here, we're about 3/16 inset on the house. So I put myself a structural right here. And just bend up with my hammer to push it out. Show you guys that it actually works here before we nail it off. There's our 3/16. There's our 1/2 inch. So when I lift up on my hammer, I gotta nail it off. So here we are on the outside of our gable. We got the other one set, we got this one set. Now we're on the outside. We're gonna nail into here. This is where our sheeting from the wall sticks up 1 3/4 inches. You can see it's almost less than a 1/4 inch gap because nothing's perfect. That's why we leave that 1/4 inch, because we want to be able to pull that gable down all the way on top of the wall without hitting the sheeting. If we hit the sheeting, it's going to fight us. Over here you can see we're almost 1/8 right there. So it's very important to just try and leave a 1/4 inch gap so you can make sure and pull that gable all the way down. So now we're going to nail off with 2 3/8 inch nails right through here. If we didn't build this gable on the ground, if we just set it like a normal sheeted gable truss, we would be nailing into that backer, that 2x6 backer. But we already nailed into that, so we don't have to use 3-inch nails right here. That gable is never leaving. Now we'll go on the inside and show you guys how we use that string line to straighten our subfascia. We'll show you right here. You can see that the subfascia bows in the middle. You have to get in line with it down there and look up the subfascia, and right now it bows in. And you'll see that that is exactly what we're seeing on our string line with our 1.5 inch marks. Okay, so here we are in the trusses. We're getting ready to use this string line, which is to straighten this truss. So the first thing we did is to plumb this other end. This is a mono pitch truss, so it's not like your normal gable. Normally you want to plumb the gable, you want to plumb the very peak, and you want to plumb each heel, which is easy because they're so short. You want to lock them in so they can't move. Then we got our catwalk in the middle. In a big gable, you would already have the middle plumbed off your catwalk. And then you would do this right here in between each side. So between the peak and the heel. But right here we have the peak is our mono pitch, which is plumbed, that's our highest point. Our heel's plumbed. So now we're coming to the middle here and we got a catwalk with a diagonal brace. Now what we're doing is someone's going to be down there looking up at this string line to make sure it hits our marks. If you remember, we messed these up. These are supposed to be aiming down, so we added a few Sharpie marks. So you'll be able to see as I push this out, I'm getting ready to nail, and the guy below me is looking up to make sure that's on the string line. So when it's on the string line, since all these are cut to length, it's going to straighten our subfascia, and at the same time it's going to make this truss perfectly straight, so when we're sheeting we can hook our tape on it and pull 24s all the way down this roof. Make sure you've unscrewed your wind braces here. You don't want to be fighting these, you just want to be able to plumb this gable by itself, because all of the spacing is pulled off of this truss. Tell me when. Okay, so that's how you build a gable truss end on the ground. Now the one on my right here, you can see it's sheeted and Tyvek, but it doesn't have any outlookers. The reason we didn't do that one all assembled is because it was so weak due to that height change right in the middle. But this trick works really great on big normal triangle gables with a peak, especially the string trick for straightening the subfascia. There are a bunch of different ways to do this, a bunch of different ways to straighten your trusses. Another way that we do it is we don't sheet up the face of the wall. That way we can put our 2x6 backer on the wall instead of on the gable truss itself before we fly it. This way worked really smooth on this house. We set each of these gables in like 10 minutes, all built, which was incredible. On the bigger gables, you're gonna have to fight it a lot more to get that 1.5 inch tight to the front of the house, to the exterior wall. But if you guys got any value out of this video, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We did an individual video about outlookers, subfascia, Tyvek, sheeting gables on the ground, setting gables, all of that. So subscribe to our channel, and thanks for watching.